Well,
what you are?
I think it's easier and it's more difficult at the same time. So, for those who don't know, in apartheid South Africa, the system was set up to specifically separate people by race. And when I say specifically, I mean it was very precise. So, unlike America, where you have a one-drop rule, in South Africa, apartheid separated people by the finest detail in their skin, by your hair. So it wasn't just black and white. It was black and white and Indian and colored. And so those things separated you. So you had some families where if a dad was just slightly darker than his kids, then that dad would have to live in a different area to the children. The children could go to a better school than maybe their dad could go to, and then the mom might be very light and she would be considered white. And this was a completely strange world for many people. So it wasn't just black or white. Coming to America, though, it's very much black or white, but then you deal with the complexities of colorism and class and a whole different identity that comes about, especially when you come from Africa. There's a whole different story that you have as an immigrant. So the race side of it is simple, and then you get into the complexities of how you interpret what is happening to you because of your race.
When I was over in South Africa, I did a story on Lindiwe Mazibuko. She used to be the head of the opposition party there, and she was a Zulu woman, but she was a bit fairer skinned. And kind of the narrative around her, because she was not with the ruling party, with the ANC, was, is she black enough? And I'm like, it's for my American audience. I'm like, she's a woman named Lindiwe who speaks Zulu. I mean, this is like as black as you can get. So I'm just kind of curious, being a fair-skinned person over here, how is your credibility as being like a man from Africa? Do people here see you as an African man? And does that bring with it a certain type of credibility about blackness that maybe you otherwise wouldn't have?
I don't know. It always varies. I can only answer that question, with regards to the people I've met. Some people have an idea of me before they meet me as a person, and when engaging in conversation, then you start to realize what you do or don't have in common. Like for instance, I found a lot of the cultural experiences I have coming from Africa are very similar to what many black Americans in the South experience, in the way you're brought up culturally, in the ideas that you have, in the ways that you address an older person, in the way you're raised within a black family. And it changes everywhere you go. The one thing I always found was black Americans were really quick and warm, in terms of welcoming me as a person once they found out I was from Africa. Like when I first lived in LA, that was my nickname in all the comedy clubs. No one bothered to learn my name. The guys at the door would just be like, "Hey, yo, it's Africa. Come on in, Africa." And I was like, I mean, there's countries as well, but whatever. Because I was like, what if another guy comes? Like, then are you going to go Africa 1, Africa 2? Just give us the countries, But I took it as it's affectionate. It's people in many ways seeking to connect with something that they know, I guess, takes them back to a story that was stolen from them. I've had many people coming up to me going like, "Hey man, which part of Africa do you think I'm from? And tell me about Africa and what's it like in this place?" And I go like, "Well, I haven't traveled all of it, but these are the stories I know. These are the places I've been. These are the people I've seen." But for the most part, I would say I have felt welcome. I have felt like, being African adds something to the experience that I have with African Americans.
You mentioned colorism a little bit, and how would you? In America, we talk sometimes about light skin privilege a little bit, and I assume you experienced that as well in South Africa. Can you talk about that experience in South Africa versus how does it compare to here?
Oh, I think it's very similar actually. That's one of the vestiges of racism is your color. Although you may still be in the same boat of being oppressed, your color would move you up a few rungs on the ladder of oppression, and that's something you can't deny. I know that having my skin tone may get me a few sentences further in a conversation than maybe someone who is darker than me would get. And that was common in South Africa, because in South Africa, I wouldn't be labeled as black. People would say I'm colored. And what was strange for me is growing up, I didn't grow up colored at all. Colored in South Africa is not just your skin tone, it's a culture. It's a culture of people who have an identity, have their own dialect within a language, have a food, a tradition, a way of living, and it's beautiful, and they've created something from a very dark past, but that's not how I grew up, and so I never shunned it. I was like, yeah, if you want to call me colored, I understand why, but I always say I'm colored by color, but not by culture. because the only reality I knew was growing up in a Xhosa household. From my grandmother to my mom to my aunt, it was a matriarchal house that defined how I lived. So I did experience that at times where people would go, "Oh, you're not black like the rest of them." That's what they would say sometimes in South Africa. They'd be like, "Oh, you're not like the rest of them. Hey, you're one of the good ones." That's what they would say. And so you came, you come to realize in life, you go like, "Oh, I see this. I see how people feel like they can team up with you against people who you actually see as your team." Because they think that you're willing to step away from it, which is really interesting.
Do they do that based off skin tone? Because I feel like that happens here a lot. Like people know, I'm a New York Times reporter. If I'm a black person who's a banker, they're like, oh yeah, you're not like the rest of them.
Right.
You're not one of them. Is it based strictly on, like, do they look at skin tone there? Is that how they figure it out, or is that?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's multiple factors. I found in my life it could be multiple things. Sometimes it's my skin tone. Sometimes it's my accent. I'll have people speak to me, and all of a sudden, they're just like, "Oh, wow, you speak really well. Wow.
You know how to talk, huh?
Yeah." And I'm like, "Yeah, I studied English in school. Do you know what I mean? We were colonized by the British."
Yeah.
But I understand it, fundamentally, because it goes back to language in many ways, and that is people have been programmed to identify language and the way people use language with who they are or what people believe they are. And so depending on how I speak, depending on where people see me and how they see me, could even be how I wear my hair, that could determine how people, conversate with me or how they treat me.
I like the way you compare both South Africa and racism in South Africa and colorism in South Africa and that in the United States. It shows you how in South Africa people are not just segregated based on their color but also based on the way they talk, also based on their hair. And in America, you have black and white, and that is all. But in South Africa, you have mixed, you have Indian, you have color, everybody that are dark skin. You that you're more dark skin, you get less privilege, and you that you're more light skin, you get less privilege. And it's really nice the way he appreciates his privilege as an individual, and coming to America, when you come across people that they see you have an accent, they just feel that you're not everybody though. You feel that you're African, right? And they categorize you as African, in which Africa is not a country. It's a continent, as I said when he was in LA, they was just confirmed, hey, this African guy. But no, deep down, he's an African person, but specifically come from South Africa, He don't just come from somewhere in Africa, and it shows you how it is really different in both countries, South Africa has gone way, 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 way above racism as compared to America, where people joke about it, people laugh about it. But in America, people still get offended about it. People don't really joke about it. People are pretty serious when it comes to it, and also when it comes to discussing about it. People are really serious about it, and it shouldn't be that way. It really shouldn't be that way. I think if we can copy what South Africans have done with racism, it will really help so much. Because if you look at it, right, and when it comes to racism, even though South Africans get a lot of benefits from the state, but they are suffering more than us in America. There's still massive segregation. If you think I'm lying, you can go on Google and Google segregation in Cape Town, segregation in South Africa, and you will see where rich people live and where poor people live. The poor people live in inhabited areas that are like shacks, and where they have like one or two toilets for like 50 people, and sometimes they don't even have water inside the house. They need to use water outside, and just the insanitary hygiene that you find in areas like that can easily cause people to fall sick and all manner like that. But still, yet with them going through all of that, they still with them going through all of that, they still have they still joke about racism. They don't take it serious. It's really nice. It shows you how things have really evolved. Things have really gone far, far, far better. It is really nice. I wish we can copy like that, though. Trust me, it would be really, really nice if we can copy like that, and not just be offended. When people talk about race and or one another and color, but if we can make it as a joke or see it as a joke, at the end of the day, it will greatly help so much. But let's continue with Trevor Noah with his questions that he answers.
There was a time I believe you had cornrows. Is that?
I did, yeah, I did. That is a very unfortunate time, and I don't think
And there
it's
was a perm
necessary.
involved
I don't
in
think
that.
it's
Is that
necessary
correct?
to bring that up. I think I've gone through enough pain in my life. That's not. Yeah, no, I did. I had cornrows for a very long time. Jagged edge inspired my hair.
I think you should go back to that. I'm just saying. I wanted to go back to something you said. You mentioned you'd always aspired to American black culture. I think, when you first were named to host the Daily Show, everyone goes and looks up your entire history. And some black Americans were critical of kind of your comedy as it relates toward black Americans. They said that you either played on negative stereotypes or you questioned their authenticity as people of African descent. I want to get back to you. I will eventually get to the root of that comedy, but I want to ask you, as someone who was living in South Africa, what was your perception of Black Americans, and how has it changed over time living here now?
Wow, that's interesting. Growing up in South Africa, my perception of Black Americans was always, it was a perception that was created by movies and TV and music. And music played a big role in that. I always saw these people they were just the coolest cool that you could imagine. It was everything from watching Boys in the Hood to the sitcom Martin to whether it was Tupac and Biggie and Puff. You were watching these people, these black people who existed in a way that I had never seen before. They seemed to command respect in their world beyond just who they were, but also like how they made people around them feel and seem. Like there was a coolness attached to what they were doing that was really powerful. And I mean, that's one of the reasons that it permeated South Africa. I know I wasn't the only young black person growing up in South Africa who identified with this. You were like, that's a piece of me. I can be that. I can be that guy driving the Benz. I can be that guy living in a mansion. I can be that guy living a great life, wearing gold chains. Like it was aspirational. It was aspirational beyond the circumstances that the people found themselves in. And so that was my identity. It was one that was limited, and it was stereotypical of one experience, and that's all I knew, and that was all I needed to know in a way.
Yeah. And what was the perception of Black Americans in terms of I guess their connection to Africa? Because I remember my first time I went to Africa was South Africa a couple of years ago. And when I arrived, I literally wanted to kiss the ground, because I feel like everyone from the diaspora, it's like you go to Africa and it's like, oh, I'm home. It's what it feels like. But quickly as I walked around, as people saw me, I could quickly tell that they could tell right away that I was not from the continent.
Right.
I'm curious, as far as the authenticity of Black people to Africa, I mean, what did you make of that, I guess?
Well, I think the mistake I made early on, and it's one that I was always bound to make because I had no direct information, was I didn't understand why Black Americans would aspire to Africa. I didn't understand why Black Americans were like, yo, the motherland, I got to get out there. I didn't understand that. I was like, but why? So you guys are living an amazing life. You're wearing Timberlands and you're driving G-Wagons. Why would you want to come here? I honestly didn't understand it. So in many ways, I know I wasn't the only African way. I found it hilarious. I was like, it's funny because you don't realize how many Black Americans have been robbed of a place they believe is their home and a culture and a story. You take that for granted. I come from a place where I can rattle off the history of my family without flinching. I can tell you about my ancestors. I can tell you about my culture. I can tell you why I do certain things because of the blood that is within me, and that's something that you don't ever think of. I never thought of that. And so whenever we would hear that, as myself and my friends would hear Black Americans saying that, or they'd come and they'd be like, "Oh man, I'm gonna kiss the ground. I'm home, baby, I'm home." And you'd be like, "This is the funniest thing I've ever seen in my life." And then you understand beneath that funny, the pain that's attached to it. And then you understand why people want to connect with the story, because they've been robbed of that story, and as you learn and as you read through the history of slavery and America and the slave trade as a whole, you come to realize how much you took for granted something that you never even thought of as a privilege, and that is knowing your story.
Yeah, that's great. I want to talk a little bit about, that approach to comedy, and talk about, it's a very divisive time, to say the least, especially when it comes to issues of race. Talk about humor, and how do you use that to maybe balance it out, balance the playing field a little bit?
Well, it's trial and error. Comedy is one of those formats where it's all about context. I always say to people, I go, a joke is always limited to the relationship you have with your audience. And it doesn't matter if you're a comedian or just somebody telling a joke to your friend. The connection and the context you have, the relationship, is what provides all of the context. You can say something to a friend of yours that, if overheard, people would reel in horror. But your friend maybe shares a context with you, and that grows with an audience as well. If you have an audience that grows with you in comedy clubs and starts doing shows with you, as I had in South Africa, you start to grow a relationship. Going back to your previous question, it's what happened to me in America. When I first came to the United States, the rooms where I was given the most time and the rooms where I was most welcomed were the urban rooms, right? And that's where, I'd be doing shows like Chocolate Sundays in LA. I would be going out and I'd be performing, in Baltimore. I'd be doing shows that were predominantly Black. And so I found my relationship to the audience was one that was contextualized by my perception of African Americans and their perception of Africa. And I played within that world, and I played with those stereotypes, breaking them down, turning them on their head, twisting it around. The mistake I made, and the one thing I regretted over time, was I took for granted how that comedy could be used against Black people in America. Because I wrote all my comedy in Black rooms.
But do you think if it's different if you say it versus if Chris Rock says it, being that he is from America? Like, is it kind of like if a white guy were to make a Black joke, can they not?
Coming from Africa, I would say my perception about African Americans was very different. Back in Africa, we had this lot of stereotype mindset about how they live, and not like that. And people have always said that they are lazy, right? Until one day, a friend of mine introduced me to this documentary called 13 on Netflix, where he talks about what African Americans went through, from the drugs that was put into the community to the Blacks being locked up in jail and separating their moms, their dads from their family, having their moms take care of the family. It really changed my perception so much about African Americans and about Black Americans. I can see at the end is we just need to learn. You might be stereotyped about somebody, but until you really learn what caused the person to be the way they are, you can't stop being stereotyped about them. So it's always good to learn, not just take what people tell you, but learn what causes this person to be that way, what causes this person to act that way, so that you can really understand from the person's own point of view why they're acting that way. And that will really help you to stop being stereotyped about them, because it is something that I myself was once a victim of too. Until I learned, then I stopped being stereotyped about them. But movies too tells you a lot of things, and I agree with Trevor now on the part of movies. There were tough movies I was watching back in the days, and there was this guy, I forgot his name, like Blade. Blade used to act really good movies back in the days. There was this tall, big guy too, I forgot his name like that. He was a good, really, really good actor back in the days that really impacted us, as also Eddie Murphy too, from Coming to America. He really, really, really impacted us big time.